A bucket. In 1325, the Italian city-states of Bologna and Modena went to war over a stolen wooden bucket. Now, before you laugh, understand that this was medieval Italy, where city-states took their pride more seriously than most people today take anything. Modena and Bologna had been rivals for decades, constantly competing for land, trade routes, and regional dominance. Modenese soldiers raided a Bolognese well and took the bucket as a trophy. Not gold, not land, not weapons. A bucket. Bologna demanded it back immediately. Modena looked at the bucket and said, no. What followed was the Battle of Zappolino, one of the largest battles in medieval Italian history, involving tens of thousands of soldiers. Historians estimate around 32,000 soldiers marched onto that battlefield. The battle itself lasted only a few hours, which somehow makes the whole thing more embarrassing. Bologna lost decisively and never recovered the bucket. To make it worse, Modenese poets actually wrote victory songs mocking Bologna for losing a war over a bucket they never got back. The bucket still sits in Modena to this day, proudly displayed in a tower called the Ghirlandina as if it is the most valuable object in Italian history, which, given what it caused, maybe it is. Bologna never got it back, and somewhere in Modena, that bucket is still sitting there quietly winning. The War of Jenkins' Ear. In 1739, Britain declared war on Spain largely because a merchant captain named Robert Jenkins held up his own severed ear in front of the British Parliament. Jenkins had been sailing his merchant vessel through the Caribbean back in 1731, 8 years before any of this exploded into a war. Spanish coast guards in the region were notorious for stopping and searching British merchant ships under the suspicion of smuggling. When they boarded Jenkins's ship, they tied him to the mast, accused him of illegal trading, and one of the officers drew a blade and cut off his ear as a brutal act of intimidation and punishment. It was a deliberate act of cruelty designed to send a message to British merchants operating in Spanish waters. He'd kept the ear in a jar ever since. For 8 years, Jenkins carried that jar with him, waiting for someone to care. When he finally stood before Parliament and raised that jar in the air, the room reportedly went completely silent before erupting into total outrage. The public demanded revenge. Newspapers ran the story for weeks. Pamphlets flooded the streets of London. People across Britain were furious that a British citizen had been mutilated by Spanish authorities, and nothing had been done about it for nearly a decade. And just like that, a preserved ear in a jar became the spark for an 8-year conflict between two empires. The war eventually merged into the much larger War of the Austrian Succession, dragging in most of Europe and costing countless lives. All because of one very patient man and his very well-preserved ear, a pig. In 1859, an American farmer on San Juan Island shot a pig that was rooting through his garden. The island itself was a powder keg long before the pig ever showed up. San Juan Island sat right on the contested border between American and British territory in the Pacific Northwest, and both countries had settlers living there under an uneasy joint occupation agreement that neither side particularly trusted. The pig belonged to the Hudson Bay Company, a powerful British trading organization with enormous influence in the region. When the farmer, an American named Lyman Cutler, found the pig destroying his potato garden for the second time, he grabbed his rifle and shot it. He actually felt bad about it afterward and went directly to the British authorities to apologize and offer payment. But the British responded by threatening to arrest him and drag him before a British court, which American settlers saw as a direct attack on American sovereignty. American soldiers showed up to protect him. British warships arrived in response. At its peak, the standoff involved around 460 American soldiers facing 5 British warships carrying over 2,000 men and 70 guns. For months, hundreds of armed soldiers from 2 countries faced off on a small island in the Pacific Northwest over one pig that should have stayed out of the potatoes. Remarkably, both sides were quietly ordered by their commanders not to fire first. The British naval commander reportedly refused to engage, saying he would not involve his country in a war over a squabble about a pig. Those might be the wisest words ever spoken by anyone in uniform. The whole standoff ended without a single human casualty, which honestly makes it even funnier. The only casualty in the entire pig war was the pig itself. The island was eventually awarded to the United States in 1872, 13 years after one very unfortunate pig made international headlines. A football match. In 1969, El Salvador and Honduras fought a war that lasted 4 days and killed thousands of people. But to truly understand how absurd this was, you need to know what was already simmering long before anyone kicked a football. Honduras had been pushing Salvadoran immigrants off land they had farmed for years, forcing tens of thousands of families back across the border into an already dangerously overcrowded El Salvador. The Salvadoran government was furious, and the Honduran government was not backing down. Tensions over immigration and land disputes had been building for years like a pressure cooker with no release valve. Both governments were under enormous internal pressure, and both desperately needed something to redirect their people's anger outward rather than inward. Then the World Cup qualifying matches arrived at exactly the wrong moment. What finally lit the fuse was a series of heated World Cup qualifying matches between the two countries. The matches descended into chaos almost immediately. Fans attacked each other in the stands. A Salvadoran girl named Amelia Bolaños reportedly shot herself after El Salvador lost the first match, and her funeral was broadcast on national television, turning her into a national martyr overnight. The second match triggered riots in the streets. Diplomatic relations collapsed. And within weeks, El Salvador launched a full military invasion complete with airstrikes and ground troops pushing deep into Honduran territory. The conflict became known as the Football War because history refuses to be boring. The fighting officially stopped after 4 days due to international pressure, but the border remained closed for years, and a formal peace treaty was not signed until 1980, 11 years after the war began. The Peloponnesian War. In the 5th century BC, the Greek city-states of Corinth and Corcyra got into a bitter dispute that pulled Athens and Sparta into what became the Peloponnesian War, one of the most devastating conflicts in ancient history. This was not just any regional squabble. This war lasted 27 years and completely destroyed the golden age of ancient Greece, ending Athens as a dominant power forever. What makes it even more remarkable is how small and personal the original trigger was. The chain of events started when Corinth felt humiliated after being excluded from influence over a colony. Corcyra had once been a Corinthian colony but had grown wealthy and independent enough to completely ignore its parent city, which was an enormous source of wounded pride for Corinth. The specific trigger was a disagreement over a marriage alliance gone wrong. A political marriage arrangement between two ruling families in a shared colony collapsed spectacularly, leading to a civil war within that colony that dragged in both Corinth and Corcyra on opposite sides. Corcyra panicked and asked Athens for military support. Athens agreed, knowing it would provoke Corinth. Corinth ran to Sparta. And just like that, a failed wedding arrangement had activated the two most powerful military alliances in the ancient Greek world. Bruised egos, wounded pride, and one bad family arrangement helped crack the Greek world in two. By the time it was over, Athens had lost its empire, its golden age was finished, and tens of thousands of Greeks across all city-states were dead. All because someone could not sort out a marriage arrangement like a reasonable adult. The incident at Petrish. In 1925, a Greek soldier chased his runaway dog across the border into Bulgaria. That is genuinely the entire origin story of this conflict. A soldier, a dog, a border. The dog ran. The soldier followed without thinking. Bulgarian border sentries spotted what looked like an armed foreign soldier crossing their territory and responded exactly as border guards are trained to respond. Bulgarian soldiers shot him. A Greek officer who raised a white flag to retrieve the body was also shot, which made the situation dramatically worse. Greece, furious, immediately demanded a full apology and financial compensation from the Bulgarian government. Bulgaria expressed condolences, but Greece was already past the point of accepting apologies. Within 48 hours, the Greek army mobilized and launched a full military incursion into Bulgarian territory, capturing the town of Petric and pushing several miles into the country. Bulgaria ordered its own soldiers not to resist, gambling that the League of Nations would intervene before things got worse. The League of Nations stepped in, condemned Greece, and ordered them to pay reparations of around 45 million French francs. Greece backed down, withdrew its troops, and paid the fine. The whole affair lasted about 2 weeks and left dozens dead. It remains one of the most embarrassing military misadventures in modern Greek history. A soldier crossed a border chasing a dog, and his government ended up paying millions in international fines. The dog's fate, by the way, is not recorded. History remembered the war but forgot the dog that started it. The Franco-Prussian War. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, a conflict that reshaped Europe and eventually led to World War I, was partly triggered by a cleverly edited telegram. What makes this story so remarkable is that it was not an accident. It was a trap. Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had been working for years to provoke France into starting a war that would unite the scattered German states under Prussian leadership. He needed France to throw the first punch. He just needed the right moment. Prussian Chancellor received a diplomatic message about a minor political disagreement. The original dispute was about whether a German prince should take the Spanish throne, which France strongly opposed. After weeks of diplomatic back and forth, the German side had already agreed to withdraw the prince as a candidate, and the crisis appeared to be completely over. Peace was essentially guaranteed, but Bismarck was not finished. He took the telegram reporting the peaceful resolution, deliberately cut out the conciliatory language, rewrote the tone to make the Prussian king sound as if he had coldly and rudely dismissed the French ambassador in public, and deliberately rewrote it to sound far more insulting before releasing it to the press. In the diplomatic culture of 1870, a public insult to an ambassador was essentially an insult to the entire nation. France felt publicly humiliated. Prussia looked arrogant. Both nations whipped themselves into a fury, and within days, France declared war. Prussia crushed France in just a few months, captured the French Emperor Napoleon III, laid siege to Paris, and then announced the creation of the new German Empire from the Hall of Mirrors inside the Palace of Versailles, deep in French territory, just to make the humiliation complete. Bismarck had essentially started a war with a copy-paste job, and won everything he wanted. The War of the Spanish Succession. In the early 18th century, a severed nose and ears helped push Europe into one of its bloodiest conflicts of the era. The War of the Spanish Succession was a massive European conflict involving most of the great powers of the time. At its heart, it was a fight over who would sit on the Spanish throne after the last Habsburg king died without leaving an heir, a question that threatened to completely shift the balance of power across the entire continent. But years earlier, a smaller and deeply personal chain of events had set the stage. The Viceroy of Naples had a disagreement with the Pope's representative over jurisdiction and church matters within the kingdom. These kinds of disputes between royal and church authority were extremely common in this era, and were usually resolved through long, tedious negotiations handled by diplomats who got paid to be patient. The Viceroy of Naples was not interested in patience. He responded by having the man's nose and ears cut off and mailed back to Rome, just to make absolutely sure the Pope understood his feelings on the matter. The Pope excommunicated the King of Naples in response, throwing the region into chaos. Alliances shifted, old grievances resurfaced. Other European powers saw an opportunity and started positioning themselves. Armies mobilized. The resulting war dragged in Britain, France, Austria, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and Spain itself. It lasted over a decade, killed hundreds of thousands of people across multiple continents, and fundamentally redrew the political map of Europe. All because one man decided that a strongly worded letter simply was not enough. Sometimes diplomacy just goes completely off the rails. The Great Game. In 1885, tensions between Russia and Britain over influence in Central Asia, a long geopolitical chess match known as the Great Game, nearly erupted into full-scale war. The Great Game had been going on for decades before this moment, with both empires slowly expanding toward each other across the vast open territories of Central Asia, like two tectonic plates grinding together in slow motion. Britain was obsessed with protecting India, its most valuable colonial possession, from any Russian expansion southward. Russia was equally obsessed with pushing south toward warm water ports that would not freeze over in winter, giving its navy year-round access to global trade routes. Every small kingdom, every mountain pass, every river valley in Central Asia became a pawn in this enormous geopolitical game. Both empires began preparing for war when Russian troops crossed into Afghan territory at a place called Panjshir, engaging and defeating Afghan forces in a battle that killed hundreds of soldiers and sent alarm bells ringing all the way to London. The British Parliament debated emergency war funding. Naval ships were put on standby. Diplomatic cables flew back and forth across Europe. The situation was genuinely balanced on the edge of a full-scale imperial war that could have drawn in most of Europe. But British and Russian officers stationed in the region were, at that exact moment, playing polo together. The game reportedly helped cool tempers just enough to allow negotiations. The two empires eventually hammered out a border agreement that gave Russia the Panjde territory in exchange for other territorial concessions, and the crisis quietly dissolved. A sporting afternoon may have been the only thing standing between a border skirmish and a world war, which makes polo arguably the most historically important sport that nobody ever talks about. The Chaco War. In the 1930s, a tiny stretch of desert called the Chaco Boreal sat between Bolivia and Paraguay. Neither country particularly wanted it. The Chaco was one of the most hostile and inhospitable environments in all of South America. Temperatures regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Fresh water was almost impossible to find. The land was flat, featureless, and largely uninhabitable even by the standards of the era. Both countries had claimed it on paper for decades, but neither had done much with it because there was genuinely nothing there worth doing anything with. But maps from the colonial era drew the borders in wildly inconsistent ways, leaving the entire territory in a legal no-man's land that both governments technically had a claim to on paper. Then the rumors started. Both governments convinced their citizens it might contain oil. The rumors were partly fueled by vague reports from foreign oil companies that had expressed passing interest in the region, which both governments seized on and amplified far beyond what the actual evidence supported. Standard Oil of the United States and Royal Dutch Shell were rumored to be backing opposite sides of the conflict, though historians debate how much direct influence they actually had. Newspapers in both countries whipped up nationalist fury. Citizens demanded action. Politicians who questioned the war were branded as traitors, and so two countries that had spent decades quietly ignoring a piece of worthless desert suddenly decided it was worth sending their young men to die for. But before anyone figured that out, the two countries had fought the Chaco War for 3 years, lost over 100,000 soldiers combined, and carved up a useless piece of scrubland that turned out to be almost entirely worthless. The conditions soldiers fought in were absolutely nightmarish. The desert heat was merciless. Clean water was so scarce that soldiers sometimes died of thirst before they ever faced an enemy, and disease killed almost as many men as combat did. It remains one of the deadliest conflicts in South American history. The oil was never there. The dead were real. Some modest oil deposits were eventually found in the region decades later, but nothing remotely close to the quantities either government had promised, and nowhere near enough to justify a single one of the lives that were lost trying to claim it.